Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the Alternate History Podcast. We're doing something a little different today. We teased this. We talked about it during our live stream, and by golly, this is one of those things we talked about we're actually going to do. Imagine that. So we talked about creating this loop in because of what we get through our Discord uh, server and through the feedback loops that are there with our folks that participate there commenting on episodes. And so our idea is to basically, I guess you can sort of think of this as a really slow version of listener mail, if you want to think about it that way, and us responding back to that, but a chance to pick up on those thoughts. And in many instances now, because we have the team, it's not the same cast of panel on each thing. So I think we'll discover that our listeners have some interesting comments here that we want to talk around, or it might be the case that somebody who wasn't able to be on that episode, that's part of the team will say, I was thinking about that. This is where I'm at. And so I'm joined today by Dylan. I'm joined today by Eric, Robert, and Chris. Chris is going to say hi to the good people. And once we do that, I'm going to jump in immediately into episode 201. So Chris, kick us off.
Hi, good people.
All right. By the way, most of you have your listening probably where it compresses out silence, so you didn't lose any time there in the process. So we're going to pick up with episode 201. Episode 201 was entitled Inverted Iberia. My recollection is, Dylan, that was you and me on that episode. And the concept here was one of the topics that came up from our listeners as we were getting ready for the live stream and had been in the queue there, which was the idea of a delayed Reconquista. So we didn't have 1492 not just being the year that Columbus sailed the ocean blue, but also being the end of the Moor influence on the Iberian Peninsula with the Reconquista, primarily at the behest of Ferdinand and Isabella, those united Spanish stalwarts that are there. And so I'm just going to read the comments here from J.S. Zoll, 5976, I think his legal name, or her legal name has been changed to that, so that we're in good shape with that. Good place for a fork, because I think what you and I did, Dylan, there is we kept Ferdinand and Isabella from connecting up. That's part of how we created the fork that we did. I knew that keeping Ferdinand and Isabella from marrying would keep Spain from uniting, but I didn't realize how easy it would be. We talked about that a little during the episode. However, I think that Columbus wouldn't have even went to Castile if it hadn't been united with Aragon. Instead, being turned bound by the Portuguese king, he would have sailed north to find another possible sponsor. Could Columbus have replaced John Cabot, parentheses, another Italian wonder, in the English history books? And so my question is, could Columbus have replaced John Cabot if he was sailing? Could Columbus have sailed for England if he had not have sailed for Spain? And go.
I mean, I think it's certainly a possibility. I think we just kind of picked Portugal because it was, close. It's just geographically close. I think it's certainly possible, especially in a time sort of before the, what did the British call their alliance with Portugal, the Grand Alliance or whatever. At that point, it's fair game. So I certainly think it's at least a reasonable possibility to say that yes, he could have gone all the way up there. I mean, you can basically take your pick of, any colonial or proto-colonial, country at that point pretty much and say, hey, look, anybody that's got the money, Columbus will sail for him, because all he wants to do is prove, even though we know this is a fallacy, he wants to prove that the world is round. The man has some globes to sell. He's got an idea. He doesn't like maps. He's not a map nerd. He's a globe nerd. And he's going to go anywhere that they'll pay him to go explore for it.
For those of you that are trying to put this together, we just got done recording what was the name we decided on that? The episode on the Mexican American War. So map nerds is a thing.
Yeah,
it is now. It is map nerds. It not only is it a thing, it's I dare say a moniker for the whole Fork in Time team.
It's some new merch in the making, is what it is.
Well, there you go. And the interesting thing to me about it, certainly what I had in my mind as you were talking there, Dylan, is I have this NASCAR version of Columbus. He's willing to stick anybody's logo, on the ship as long as they're paying for him to sail, right?
Yeah, and the other fun thing is, if depending on your perspective on the map, he could literally be NASCAR, because the Americas are a left turn from somewhere.
Right. and we know NASCAR for the most part is just a series of never-ending
left
turns. Yeah. To me, I think I did this in one of the episodes that I did. That was one of the latter solo episodes that I did. Where you start from Europe also determines where you end up, because of the way winds and prevailing currents and those types of things happen. And so, again, assuming that Columbus is sailing for England, it's not that he's going to land in where we know him landing in the Bahamas. In the real timeline voyages, it's going to be more like where a Cabot or where
Cabot landed,
some of the other. Yeah.
So he could literally have landed in NASCAR country.
Exactly. At the end of the day.
So where do we think that is?
I think best
NASCAR
case scenario,
country or where he lands.
Where he lands. Well, I mean, Dylan, I live in Missouri. I know all about NASCAR country.
The title of this episode may already be NASCAR country for old men, but that's a whole other thing.
But where do you think he lands in the U.S. or what is now the U.S.?
I think the Mid-Atlantic is still my concept there. The very reason that most of the other English things that why you have a Jamestown, why you have a Roanoke, all of those things make sense, and so you land pretty much at the same place.
Chesapeake Bay. That's my.
The interesting question I have is this: the United States, the colonies that turn into the United States are agricultural colonies. You have to settle them and you have to work them. The colonies that Spain founds are not, and they get a lot of money very quickly out of just grabbing stuff.
And that was actually the thing that Dylan and I talked about a great deal on that episode, is the influx of gold and riches from the New World, where Spain was the beneficiary in the real timeline. What if they're not the beneficiary because of the delayed Reconquista? And what does that mean for all kinds of other things globally, but all kinds of other things continentally at the end of the day, and even in the religious conflicts that are coming up?
But so what does it do if the New World isn't an ATM you can show up with and just get a lot of very mobile wealth out of very quickly?
Well, it may not even be that much of a question. It may just be, okay, what happens if the ATM is for the other religion? Okay. Even, if it's, I think it's probably going to be a little bit of both. I think the British probably don't find that kind of level of stuff, but also, what does that do to the wars of religion? And I think it's a fair kind of toss up, no matter what happens at that point.
Which actually is the second part of the comment from our listener here that we're talking about, which he goes on to say, also on the subject of religion, would any of the other possible countries to quote unquote discover the Americas force the conversion of the indigenous people basically in the same way that the Spanish did in their search for El Dorado? So his question is, honestly, the more I read about Columbus, the more you learn about Columbus, the less you like Columbus. I think that's a fair thing to say very quickly. But so what prevails there? Who he's sailing for or who he is, I guess, actually is sort of the question in play there at the end of the day, and whether this is more, we're not quite really there yet in terms of what is going to happen, in the sense of what we know to be the Reformation and other things that go with that. That's not quite happened when we're in 1492 here. So it's also a quick place for me to go to realize that in 1492, if he's sailing for England, England is still part of the one little C, big C Catholic Church at this point. So is there really a difference, or is there not a difference? How much of this was sort of the Spanish way to do it versus an English way to do it? To your point, Chris, it's a different place you're landing and a different thing that's going on. It's not as easy to exploit. But
English Catholicism is still different than Spanish and Portuguese Catholicism.
Agree.
And it changes. And if you look at what was the English response to Native Americans, the Spanish response was enslave / convert / build missions. Oh, by the way, we need you to help us find the city of gold. The English response to natives was, you can move west, or we are going to kill you. We think you should move west. I mean, let's be real. That was kind of the response to Native Americans from an English perspective is it's our land now. Thank you. Bye.
But you know what? I'm going to go ahead and be contrarian here. The reason the Spanish, maybe this is kind of a chicken and egg type of thing. The reason the Spanish could adopt their policy is because they were landing with a bunch of soldiers.
Yep.
And their home country didn't have a whole bunch of immigrants looking to settle. That is very different in the British colonies because of the religious unrest and all of these other things going on, they did have a lot of they needed that room. They had people to fill up that seaboard. So maybe if this is happening before, I mean, basically the Civil War and all of these other things, which, throw forward to another episode, we're going to get to Cromwell as an immigrant. But maybe Britain, if the British don't have that kind of well of people to throw to settle something, maybe they don't try and empty out their colonies of the native peoples.
Question.
Well,
so I guess ultimately coming back to the listener's point, if it's Columbus, is it really that different? What prevails? Who he's sailing for or who he is?
I think where he
lands.
I think it doesn't matter. I think the Spanish are going to Spanish with whoever they get to the New World, because and Chris and I kind of went back and forth about this in one of our Viking episodes, but especially with colonialism and the different approaches to it, I think the quote unquote discovery of the New World is, okay, you win the gold medal. Congratulations, you did it. What are you going to do with it? And that is where I think the different national characteristics of everybody is really what starts to kind of lay the tapestry in terms of, this area looks like this area looks like this. I mean, because we could, for all we know, it could have, John Cabot could have discovered America before Columbus, and we could have had Cabot Day and, or Vespucci Day or, whatever. I think, insert your weird, strange Italian Super Mario Brothers reject explorer in the pilot seat. I think
as long as it is still a federal holiday that we get off.
Oh no, I'm never going to argue against that. It's always going to be a federal holiday.
Sorry.
and by the way, I have the ultimate resolution to how to deal with Columbus Day versus Indigenous Peoples Day. My grandson was born on that day.
So it's just Connor's birthday.
That's exactly right. You can call it whatever you want to. It's Connor Days. So let's just be clear on that while we're at it. All right. Yeah. Don't want us to go too deep here because we could easily get, wrapped up in the whole thing here, but just wanted to hit that. Then we moved on to episode 202 entitled Thor in a Toga. Fantastic GPT clip artwork there, by the way, for those of you that haven't seen that or aren't checking in with that. I'm trying to include these images. I'm including these images as the actual images in our feed now, so they're coming across. But the question there, this was the concept of what had happened if Constantine hadn't converted in 312. And so what we led down to is what would have been the path for Christianity over the next little bit. We end up talking about, other religious traditions and or even other Christian traditions that were sort of pushed out by the Latin version of Christianity over time. And so looking here to see what the comment was, but actually we sort of didn't have one. Oh, the question from Armitage Shanks. By the way, Armitage, we will get a room where it happened out for you because I know you like to do that air violining. We hear you. We understand. We're going to get there from the theme from that. But his question was, if you have less of this influence, basically, I'll just read it. You asked for feedback. The one thing sprung forth from this probably was the next millennium, the top and cleverest advisors were either eunuchs or celibate men, with them having a broader view of spread along the Renaissance or Enlightenment. The idea here is that with the rise of the influence of the Catholic Church, Christianity as we know it coming out of Constantine's conversion, so celibate priests, that type of thing versus something that might have been less that. That's one thing we talked about in the episode. So his question is, does it matter in terms of how we would have gotten to the Renaissance or Enlightenment if you have less eunuchs and celibate men involved? And I'm going to get way back from that because I don't know if I want to wade into that or not.
I'm going to say it actually delays it if we don't, but not as much as you think. I think on the one hand, Chinese history for one, and Oriental history is filled with, eunuchs rising to high court positions, just like everything else. So I think that would have always kind of been a thing, at least to some extent, depending on your cultural traditions. I mean, you've got, the Ottoman court's kind of the same thing to a certain extent, but there's nothing quite like the Catholic Church in the 400s to the 1400s in terms of a dumping ground for all of your second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, and eighth sons that you have nothing to do with and that aren't worth giving any land to. So I think if you can't get rid of those sons in a way that keeps them from producing any heirs, I think some of the dynastic squabbles of Europe are going to be much more complicated in ways that we cannot even fathom, just because of the number of feudal lords that could just give them to the Catholic Church and kind of get them out of the picture.
An example of something we even just mentioned here is the idea, he's often has been a subject of our podcast because of the co-founder of this podcast and her love for all history English. Henry VIII was not intended to be the king. And so
I think we have an episode on that.
We have multiple episodes on that. All roads lead to that. All roads lead to Rome, and all roads lead to something around Henry VIII and not having a male heir, or not having early on. But the concept there was he was trained for the clergy before he accidentally falls into being and that did have an influence on the form of what became a form of English Protestantism. And to Robert's point earlier, either in this episode or somewhere else, we were talking about this whole in this episode, the whole concept here of even though English was Eric's, that was your point. Even though English is Catholic, it's a different form of Catholic, even at this point, because of Wycliffe and because of some of the other movements that have been going on that set the seeds for what will be, the Reformation in England, without getting too far down that path. But to your point, Dylan, you had all of that's where you're right. That's where the second plus sons all went for the most part. We're into that, and if you change that, it does change what goes on there in terms of, fighting over daddy, who's the king died, where's the will, kind of thing is what you get into pretty quick.
I also think there's an argument to be made. It might somehow change some of the Reformation because you don't have very clearly illegitimate progeny running around. If you're just okay with priests having kids,
you mean the Pope can't have hookers? Are you trying to tell me something?
No, the Pope. I am not infallible on any matters whatsoever. The Pope can have as many hookers as he wants. He just can't sire children with them. That's the rule. How he gets away with that is up to him to decide one way or the other. That being said, the very clear hypocrisy of this probably assists in the whole idea of the Reformation. And maybe if they don't have this rule in place, it might not be such a glaring, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
All right, I'm going to keep us moving here just because it's my job to keep us moving because we can easily stall on these things. Episode 203.
On Popes and their hookers? Yeah.
Yeah. By the way, not going to be the episode title. Just not going to be the episode title. Just ain't. And I may have to put the explicit tag on it just because of that, just to be safe.
Yes.
But the episode 203, Peter Parker goes to camp. We went in an entirely different direction here, thanks to Elaine and Ash wanting us. This was her suggestion for the live stream, wanting us to do one of our little poppy ones here. So I know we talked about a lot of stuff on that. Helena's response is the one I'm going to get to because it was her topic. So I feel like we owe her that response back. Because what we did in that episode, we sort of flipped Marvel and DC's roles to the greatest degree. That's a lot of what we did in that episode that was there with, and I think it's a safe thing to say that when Dylan, Chris, and I did that episode, we felt like we were way out of our depth in terms of we're nominal comic book guys, but we know those real comic book guys, and we felt like we were in a dangerous place there. But her thing was, I'll just pick out part of it because she gave some great feedback, by the way. Provides the interesting perspective there, which is what we did, sort of flipping Spider-Man and Batman, which was her thing. Also, Marvel had one thing DC never had: Stan Lee. There is no DC equivalent of Stan. He was the closest thing the 20th century had to another P.T. Barnum, teller of tall tales, showman, and relentless self-promoter. A great sentence in English right there. Just right. She wins the prize for a great sentence in English right there. So, one thing that I'm curious about is, to the extent that I understand that, he makes the cameo in every MCU movie and all the stuff that's there. When she hits upon the fact that how big a deal was Stan Lee in all of this exercise? Any thoughts on that?
For Marvel, the huge deal.
Oh, yeah. It doesn't exist without Stan because
it doesn't exist without Stan.
He knew Kirby was the writer and came up with the better characters and all that good stuff. But Stan Lee knew how to promote, knew how to do things. And he was the one who sold Saban, I think it was Saban Entertainment, on, hey, you know what? Yeah, when we went bankrupt, we had to sell off Spidey and the X-Men and the Fantastic Four, but you know what? We still own the Avengers. And then you get the timing of the Robert Downey Jr. and, if Iron Man in the MCU does not exist without RDJ. I'm just going to stand firm on that statement.
I agree with that.
He is Tony Stark. Like, you could not have picked a better Tony Stark. And so the timing was perfect. The entry was perfect. And that first Iron Man, was a great movie.
Yeah, and I agree with her comment on the timing. You go too early and you get the unwatchable Fantastic Four movie that was done before the one with Jessica Alba in it. They actually did one before that that's just...
Is that the one that you can't actually find anymore?
That is the one you cannot find anymore. That is correct.
So unwatchable because it wasn't fun to watch, and unwatchable now because it's just unwatchable. It doesn't exist, right?
Yeah. The special effects made the MCU. You don't really have that capability until the point of when you did Iron Man to that point. And so you're not there. Stan is the man, and who would not have paid to hear him at the end of every Spider-Man episode instead of next week you had Stan Lee going Excelsior. I mean, who would not have paid to hear that?
Thanks to Helena for suggesting that. We had a lot of fun doing that episode that we sort of stumbled through and stumbled into. And I think
Don, can I recognize Helena for being a gifted writer?
I can.
Yes, I'm looking at a comment that she talks about where she critiques my J. Jonah Jameson, and she describes him as a fuming, bombastic martinet of a newspaper editor with a bristling toothbrush mustache. I mean, you cannot write like that anymore. It's incredible.
Her prose is nimble, it is descriptive, it is cutting when it needs to be. So Helena, chef's kiss. Good.
I may have made a previous, again, we are recording right after the Mexican-American War episode. I know I made a reference to monkeys locked in a room with typewriters. It would take them even longer.
Yes.
To emulate.
It would take them eons to make the kind of prose that Helena gives on a daily basis. So bravo, Helena.
I appreciate you saying that, Eric, because I feel the same way. And one of the things, again, I say this all the time. I know it feels like I'm harping on it because I am harping on it, is that one of the things I love about our Discord server when we get the feedback there, and we have a group of 10 to 12 pretty solid, consistent, contributors that are there. And they're engaged with the show, which I enjoy, and they're engaged in this kind of way. As you said, Dylan, that's an unbelievable sentence in the English language and deserves to be recognized in and of itself. Episode 204 led Chris and me, I guess it was. Matthew Perry. I think I did this exact same thing. Commodore Perry.
Mm-hmm.
we talked about him being prevented from opening up Japan in 54. And one of the interesting backdrops to that, again, shout out to Helena again, is we were doing that about the time that the Shogun remake, the FX Shogun remake, was drawing towards its close. By the way, highly recommend it. Well done for all kinds of reasons. There, it's one of those things actually made me want to go read the novel, because I've never read the novel. I've only seen the adaptations of it. Now I want to read the novel to understand the core material a little bit better. But I love her comment here. It's I didn't know too much about the Perry expedition. Again, it's the U.S. opening that up, but I've heard his fleet's appearance in Edo Bay being described as much like an alien mothership hovering over New York at Independence Day, or L.A. and V, take your pick. The one pop culture thought. This is a little bit of a shout out to my son-in-law to a degree here. The one pop culture thought was an alternate timeline for Japan. If their involvement in World War II is somewhat different, because we eventually got there in our episode, Chris, and atomic bombs aren't deployed over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the whole timber of Japan's understandable fear of nuclear weapons could disappear. So the modern day outcome of that is no Godzilla movies. Thoughts on that, guys? And by the way, my son-in-law is a massive Godzilla fan. That's why I mentioned this.
I mean, I'm not a massive Godzilla fan, but that still seems like a shame. I do still like I like the occasional Godzilla movie.
So let's go ahead and throw this out there. Like, if it's not necessarily Japanese, I we've danced around this on a couple of episodes, that it was almost advantageous that nuclear weapons were invented at the end of a war instead of between a war, so that they could be used and everybody saw, and I think we all can kind of say it prevented their use at the beginning of it. What if they are used? I mean, this gets back to kind of, we talked about, if it's an Alexis episode, all roads lead to Henry VIII. If it's a me episode, all roads lead to preventing World War II. I don't think we do it here, and I think if it's not Japan, it's another country that has them used, and could, maybe it's China talking about a Yeti coming down from the Himalayas with radioactive powers versus coming out of the Pacific. But I think there's something to be said for, and we can talk about what does that do for the different cultural influences on whatever radioactive monster this creates.
Yeah.
So what you're telling me, Chris, is that you're envisioning, instead of Godzilla, we have what essentially amounts to the Nintendo 64 game Rampage being the basis for atomic pop culture references. I'm not saying I disagree with it. I like it. I'm just saying.
The other thing from that episode, just picking up on Dezel 1963's comment here, is that we talked a little bit about how potentially Japan could have become more under the influence of the United Kingdom versus the United States and who they interacted with. And so the question that's asked there is, the Japan differential under that scenario is what they're raising. I'll just read it here. You mentioned Australia and New Zealand, similar to what would have happened to a British Japan. Interestingly, we still have a British governmental system culturally. Now, this writer obviously from those nations. I think we have pivoted to much more of the U.S. in the last 50 years. So I guess my question off of this take is, the United States flows out of a British system. Other nations that were part of the Commonwealth, have flown out of a British system. What's the significance of that? The fact that we share this British connection with a lot of these Western democracies around the world, and that sort of includes Japan now, post World War II. Any thoughts on that? Because we sort of touched on that, Chris, in the episode, but it was just you and me.
I guess I'll take a stab at that. I think one of the issues is that legal tradition, and to kind of throw it out there for our one lawyer here, looking right at you, man. That's what you get for ditching an episode. that we have a legal and governmental framework that is focused, like, where property is it. Property is the most important thing conceivable. And the contractual framework that leads to almost it lends itself very easily to trade between these nations.
Is that a question?
It's a thought.
It's a provocation to Dylan.
Yes, it really is. I'm just lobbing stuff at him at this point.
Hey, don't.
I'm poking the Yeti.
I actually think it's
don't make Dylan go sovereign citizen on you. I'm just telling you, don't make Dylan go sovereign citizen on you.
By the way, there's your episode title: "Poking the Yeti."
Poking the Yeti.
I actually think it's more interesting from a sort of geopolitical context, just because if you think of if Japan's not sort of American and it's more British, then that sets up some interesting interplays between the Philippines and Japan as sort of the American, Asian islands versus the UK Asian islands. To respond to Chris's heinous softball question, I don't think at this point, in the 1850s and back half of the 18th century, I don't think the difference between American and English law is really all that different, other than, a slight preference for codification on the American side. So much of American law is descended from English common law. I don't think it's really going to do much of a functional difference other than replace the word senator for MP in some things. And that's kind of about it.
Oh, no, but I'm saying in this case, in our timeline, it wasn't really American law being put into Japan. It was the Japanese staying independent and keeping their own traditions. In this case, it would be British law being imposed on them.
Yeah, but in terms of, I still think that there's going to be so much of Japan's history is them being sort of a cultural island and sort of, mono myth, that I think even with a British scheme imposed on top of it, I think that's only going to penetrate so far. And I don't think that's going to be a whole lot different from, a sort of American penetration into Japanese culture. It's always going to be mostly Japanese. It's just, to use one of my favorite analogies, you're just putting a different color lipstick on the pig, kind of sort of deal.
I'm going to skip over the next episode, 205, which was our first in a stated 3-part series, which is the revolves around what in the real timeline was an unsuccessful assassination attempt in 1996 against President Clinton. So, because we're going to come back to that, but just so our listeners know, we will incorporate the feedback we have from that episode in our subsequent episodes, which we're excited to get back to.
Hey, Don, if I could make a specific, Amazon Evan 19 made a comment about the Constitution specifying that is actually covered in the Presidential Succession Act that was passed in light of, don't help me out, 25th Amendment?
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Presidential Succession Act was right after that.
Okay. So that actually was covered in that. So we do actually have legal precedent for that. I did know that.
Yeah. We talked about we found like the one thing that it didn't really address. There was the one thing, because the problem you fall between before the Electoral College meets, you don't have a president elect, which is where it gets a little challenging there. You have a presumptive president elect, but you don't have a president elect yet, which is where it gets a little bit dicey.
Nebulous. Okay.
Yeah. So we're gonna move through here a little bit, and I think there's one more that we'll cover before we'll circle back on this. This was episode 206, which was Viking Victory. Again, this came out of a suggestion that was one of the non-winners in the live stream vote, but we picked it up here because we wanted to hit those things. So the idea here was in the race for the English crown in 1066, because you sort of have William, the Duke of Normandy, and you have the Vikings, and Dylan had a fun job on that episode, by the way, setting it up, because it's not an easy setup with all the names. And I seem to remember there's multiple heralds there, if my memory is serving correctly, and other things as well. Got a little challenging. But this idea of it's not William of Normandy who wins the race here. It's actually the Vikings that win the race that particular time. and so the let's see if I can pull out the whole idea is kind of the comments here. So I'm going to pick up again on first of all, Armitage Shanks says disappointed no Alexis from Texas, because we were actually talking about English history. We had the audacity to not have Alexis on a podcast, so bad on us. And we talked about on the episode a lot of the difference between the English king being a French vassal and sort of how that played out versus what would have happened with the Vikings. But going down to Dezel's 1963's comment, what if Harold, the UK version, loses to Harold, the Norwegian version in the first battle, then Harold, the Norwegian version, ends up fighting William? Two options. Harold in, meaning from Norway, beats him, which will leave a vacuum in Normandy and a chance for Harold in to continue on to the continent, or Harold loses but leaves vacuum in Norway. This could spin two very different runs of future impact. So I'll open that up for comments here. But one of the things I know we talked about on that episode was this whole problem of, is there more Vikings in Europe, or is there more, which way does this play out? Because it's almost like England's the buffer, in this period of time. It's like the buffer state or the in-between that folks are trying to capture. Thoughts on that, guys?
So I guess I'll take a stab at it. I like the setup potential, but I don't know that it would happen either way. So whoever loses in Normandy, I don't think they're at risk of leaving a power vacuum in Scandinavia or the continent, just because these claims that they're fighting over are so dynastic at this point that they're very targeted, so Harold Hardrada, for instance, his claim on England is very different from him, say, beating William the Conqueror and that then leaving Normandy up for him to conquer. Well, that's true from a tactical sense. He's in a political sense, he has no basis for it. He's risking excommunication by the Pope. He's risking all of these consequences for basically just running off and doing whatever he wants. Whereas England's the battleground, because that's the place where all of these guys arguably have a stake in the fight. If Harold Hardrada beats William of Normandy and then he goes over to Normandy, I mean, everybody's going to be like, dude, what are you doing here? Get out. So I do like the idea. I think it's really kind of an interesting bouncing off point. I think that for our approach to alternate history, where we try and find some factual basis, I think it does present some problems. But if we can find a way, it'd be interesting.
I would just say for now, I think in the initial, this generation, I agree with you. I think this is something I kind of brought up on that episode, which is give people enough dynastic generations, and they're gonna find a reason to insert themselves into this power vacuum.
It's
so maybe not right now.
Yeah, it's the Jeff Goldblum axiom of world history. Life finds a way.
Yeah. Succession finds a way at the end of the day, right? I do think it's interesting here, Brian N., who has become more of a frequent contributor, references, some of the ideas about how this could have impacted language because of what's going on there, in terms of which languages are influencing other, and again, tying back to French. But as we sort of draw to a close here, because we're only going to go a little ways into this and we'll pick it back up. We'll do our final shout out of this particular episode for Helena, because she pointed out, that's all great, guys, but the Bayeux Tapestry would have been different. The Normans reintroduced rabbits to England, so she makes a reference to Beatrix Pottersditter would be writing about Harold the Hare versus Peter Rabbit. So again, Helena's she's operating on a whole different level than we are when she looks at this stuff. That's the point of this, is that we're thinking about, the obvious things in history. She's thinking about the impacts on literature, 500-600 years down the road. That's where she goes with this, which I think was sort of fun. Any thoughts on that before we close out this little brief first stab at doing a little listener feedback stuff?
I think this is a great first listener feedback.
Okay, good deal. Well, again, we wanted to do this we don't want these to be as long as our normal episodes. We'll do them frequently enough because they're also good filler episodes for us. But also, we encourage our listeners to go and give us the feedback. That's the whole reason for doing this, for us to have a chance to come back around to it. And if you have a very particular thing, say, I want you to address this in the feedback, we'll make sure that we do that instead of just scanning through what's there. So again, we just want to remind our listeners to visit our website, www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Links there to access the Discord server. We're doing a really good job with our show inventory. So that means we have shows that are around early. So one of the benefits you can get if you choose to be a patron is you get early access. And so occasionally I'll see posts in our Discord from some of our patrons who have listened to an episode that others haven't listened to yet. So just a quick push there. We don't like to harp or go too much about supporting the show financially, but for as little as $2 a month, you can get that early access. And now that's actually meaningful compared to what it used to be in the past, because by golly, we get those episodes out early now because we have them to get out early. So that's there. And if you haven't had a chance, one of the things that I just have fun. I use ChatGPT to do this, to generate the art for each episode. Now I have it come up with something based on what's there. And I'm looking here at the next one that we'll pick up when we come back to the listener thing, which is the Caboose Compromise. And I'm amazed at how ChatGPT incorporated basically Ticket to Ride in changing the path of the U.S. Transcontinental Railroad. I'm a Ticket to Ride player, so I appreciate that. And I thought that was pretty cool. So on behalf of the team, that would be Chris, Eric, Dylan, and Robert. We want to say thank you for listening. Thank you for giving us feedback. Hope you enjoyed this first little exercise of this. We'll come back and do it again. And we encourage you to be back next week because we got lots of stuff in the queue. So we'll see what's coming next. Thanks, guys.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.